And I'd like to welcome everybody to our 243rd episode, talking about exploring changes in duck harvest distribution in the Mississippi Flyway. So my name is Benji Cohn with Minnesota DNR. I'm joined today by almost my cube mate. He was right over my cube here not too long ago. Bram is our wildlife biometrician. So Bram, I'll turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Yes. Hi, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about work I did for the University of Missouri in the last couple of years. I just started with the DNR a year and a half ago, but it's still very applicable to the state of Minnesota as well. So I thought I would hop in and talk about ducks today. This is going to be a shortened version of all the work we've done, but if you want to read more, we have 2 published publications and one in revision right now, hopefully coming out next year, early next year. Those will be in the chat, links to those. So if you want to read more, you can look at those. All right. First, we'll talk a little bit about waterfowl. Oh, let me see. All right, there we go. So waterfowl. What are waterfowl? Waterfowl, things like ducks, geese, and swans. And just to get us started a little bit, a question for people out there. How many waterfowl species are ever been observed in the state of Minnesota? So think about that for a little bit. I looked at some eBird data, which is a citizen science project. And it might be maybe more, maybe less than you think, but there's actually 44 different waterfowl species ever been observed. I don't know if that was higher than you thought, maybe. Of those, 36 different duck species. And they range from all kinds of things, like things that might be very common and you're familiar with. So for example, the mallard. Hopefully everybody knows the mallard. It's a very recognizable duck, also called the greenhead. We have a blue-winged teal, which is pretty common in the state. Gadwall, a duck like a northern shoveler. We also have a couple of species called diving ducks, like a common goldeneye and a ringneck duck. And just to explain dabblers versus divers, it's really just is determined by how they feed. So dabbling ducks feed on the surface, and diving ducks, they dive for their food. Other birds that you might not have seen in the state but have visited before, either due to migration or just because they end up getting a little lost, are things like king eider. It's a very pretty bird. Surf scoter, also more of an ocean bird. And even things like the smoo, which is just a funny word, but also a beautiful bird. So most of these waterfowl species, including ducks, they're migratory. And that means that the distributions are often continental. So ducks we have in the state, they're actually part of this humongous population that actually spans most of North America. So what you can see here is the distribution of the mallard. Breeding distributions range is in reddish. And then we have a separate wintering range in blue all the way at the south. And everything in purple is just a year-round range. So birds there could spend the winter there, but it's also suitable for breeding. Other birds like the surf scoter, as I said, was kind of a sneaky one. It only comes by during migration, which is shown in yellow, and actually breeds all the way up north in Canada, close to the Arctic Circle. And then it winters along the coast on the ocean. They're actually a sea duck. And this is a picture of the blue-winged teal. Actually winters all the way in South America. It's the furthest migrating duck that we have. And there's some resident populations actually in South America as well, as you can see by the purple in the lower right corner of your screen. And what you see here is that, like, yes, not all individuals of a species actually breed in Minnesota. They have a very wide range. So there's a lot of migration going on. And ducks in North America kind of follow 4 separate migratory flyways. And we call those, on the right, you can see that, the Pacific Flyway, the Central Flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, and then the Atlantic Flyway along the coast. And on the left, you can kind of see a representation of like what routes ducks actually take. And although you can see those separate flyways pretty well, you can also see that there's a little bit of overlap here and there with, for example, some blackbirds that belong to the Atlantic Flyway and winter over there. They do breed all the way in the middle of northern Canada. So there's some overlap there as well. So of all these birds that come through our state, how many ducks actually nest in Minnesota? And how is that determined? Well, it is determined by total number of ducks in the flyway, but also the spring weather conditions and the number of suitable ponds in the state. And at this point, we have a DNR May waterfowl surveys. Every May, we take a plane out and we observe waterfowl throughout the state to get a population estimate of how many birds breed in our state. We follow 19 duck species that are counted regularly, so those would be considered breeding in the state. And we've been doing this since 1968, so we have very long-term data sets. And I put some data out. The Waterfowl Survey Report 2026 just came out today. And you can see that there's quite some variation. There was some high number of mallards between the 1990s and the mid-2000s. After that, this decreased a little bit, but it's pretty stable. But one of the things you can see is that it fluctuates wildly from year to year. You can have some good years, you can have some bad years, depending on like how wet the spring was in the state, but also in the states around it. But in the grand scheme of things, population seems to be pretty stable in the state here. So that's during the breeding season. But what I'm mostly interested in is like the fall and the winter. And this is a period of time where ducks are of economic importance. People like to hunt, maybe you as well. People like to bird watch. I know I do. They're also cultural importance, and they're also potential indicators of wetland health. So it's pretty great to see birds in the winter. However, how does a duck actually determine when to move and where to end up in the winter? That depends on a lot of reasons. The main reasons for a duck to leave in a certain area where it's happily been breeding could be a lack of habitat. In this case, like open water. If all the water freezes, it's time to go. And it is correlated to the lack of food. There might not be any food in the water because it's frozen over. There might not be any food available in agricultural areas because there's too much snow. So some of those cues for leaving make a duck decide that it wants to go south. It could be cold temperatures, it could be snow cover, as you can see. It could be favorable winds. They often wait a couple days to lower those energetic costs and go with the winds. It could also be something like photo period. If the days start to become a little shorter, it might be a trigger for them to get going. And the important thing is that these cues can differ among species and how important they are. Some species are very focused on cold temperatures. Some species are very focused on photo period, which is fascinating. Another thing is that a landscape is not the same from year to year, right? I took this random photo from an undisclosed location, and I showed the same photo in 2 different years. In 15th of December 2024, there was a lot of snow on the ground, and the next year it was beautiful. There was no ice, no cover, and this wetland that you can see was actually available. So different environmental and climatic conditions and weather conditions in a given year create different conditions and triggers for birds to actually leave the state. That said, despite all that variation from year to year, we also have to realize that the world has been changing. And we see observed widespread changes in climate and weather conditions, as you can see, especially in the north. And I circled Minnesota here. Planet's just getting a little warmer, and so is the country. And of course, the availability and hydrology of wetlands. There's been a lot of wetlands that have been drained and transformed into agriculture. You can see that agriculture and urban land use has increased in areas, especially with populations of humans increasing. And also I have to say that the last 10 years that we've seen some of the warmest in recorded history. So although there's like annual variation from year to year, we also see some systematic change. And extreme weather, and it will become more common. So 2 years ago, we had like headlines like brutally cold temperatures impacting much of the US. And I don't know if you remember that, but I normally bike to work, and I didn't even bike to work that winter. Winter storms bring possible record-breaking Arctic cold. And even in Europe, there was extreme freezing temperatures, numb Norway. And there's not a lot of cold temperature that can numb the north. And also, extreme cold snaps could get worse as the climate warms. So extreme weather could become more common. So these changes in climate and land use could really lead to shifts in like average winter distributions of these ducks. Okay, so why do we need to know about that? Well, it's actually really important to know about animal distributions from a management perspective, which is what I'm interested in. So I came up with a hypothetical example of a species that we've been observing, and we're doing a really good job figuring out where it is, and we come up with a species range. I was like, okay, it's mostly in the top 2/3. We can suggest a number of management areas and go manage those areas for the species. For example, let's say a mallard. But what in the next year, or like over time, not in the next year, but over long time periods, this range moves further north. And suddenly you get a couple of these proposed management areas that are not really working out. So these management decisions informed by historical distributions might not really be that useful. So in that case, we could raise questions like, should we shift? Where do we do the management? Or should maybe management focus on different species that do still occur on those areas? And that's similar issues for hunters and bird watchers, right? You can't really like hunt birds anymore if they have moved further north and they no longer occur in your part of the state during the time that you want to go hunting. So how do we answer those questions? And to sum up those questions, how have distributions changed? And what is driving those changes? That's the key interest of my research. And to answer those, you need long-term data at a large spatial scale. And you have a couple options, and people have used those. You can, of course, use direct surveys, like local surveys, like we do in the summer with the May waterfowl survey. We can look at the breeding bird survey, which is also a summer survey, which has existed for a long time. The Christmas bird count, CBC, which is useful to look at wintering birds. It's also a survey that existed for close to 100 years, if not more. And an eBird, which is a citizen science program. And eBird has citizens report their local bird lists and contribute to like making cool maps, such as this one. I'm not entirely sure what does a canvasback and a blue-winged teal on the same page, but we'll just ignore that for now. But it creates like cool maps where you can see where species are increasing or decreasing, in this case in the prairie pothole region. We could also use other techniques that are newer, like GPS or other remotely sensed data. So in this case, the mallard is equipped with a radio transmitter, GPS transmitter, and we can kind of follow it along and talk about timing of migration, where is it stopping at certain locations, and what kind of decisions go into a bird deciding to move north or south. And then the third way that we are using for this particular study is indirectly or using band recoveries or wing harvest data. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, what that is. Let's start with band recovery data. So that's been monitored and handled by the USGS, the Bird Banding Laboratory, and there's data since the 1960s. So that checks our list of being long-term, and it's nationwide, so it's also a large scale. So how they collect this data, lots of people band birds right after breeding. There's a time where most birds are molt leased in waterfowl. That means they can't fly very well or at all. And as you can see here, these Canada geese in the top picture, they're being corralled. They can't escape, and they're easy to catch and deploy hundreds and thousands of bands. This is a continental scale effort, so it's great. We have birds from all over the place throughout the breeding regions, including by the Minnesota DNR, who also deploys like thousands of metal bands on duck legs. And eventually, to get data, these bands need to be recovered. And with waterfowls, a hunted species, they're recovered by hunters or by finding dead birds, but most of them are found by hunters. And often they're used to estimate survival to like fuel population models. We're also using wing harvest data, also called the parts collection survey. You might be more familiar with that term. And that's maintained by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And it has since 1961, so almost the same time frame, also a long-term data set. In this case, we have a sample of hunters that is asked to submit harvested wings. And normally that's used to estimate age and sex ratios. But what it also tells us is where these ducks have actually been located, because they need to be present to be shot. And so we were wondering, can we use this as a proxy for duck distributions? And you think like, okay, a proxy for duck distributions, but for a duck to be shot, it doesn't need to be just somewhere present, but a hunter also needs to be present to like shoot the duck. And so potentially there could be effects of hunting pressure on this metric. Well, then you're right. In this case, we wanted to explore that a little bit more, and we would say changes in harvest distributions are pretty equal to changes in duck distributions if the regulations do not change. But they have changed. They have changed quite substantially and not always the same in neighboring states. So we might have to correct for this hunting effort to actually have our data really depict what we wanted to do, which is duck distributions. But first we have to figure out how these hunting regulations have changed. Well, they've changed quite a lot. So this is 1960, and you can see all the hunting zones, or the lack thereof. There's not been a single hunting zone at that point. And then we started introducing hunting zones and splits. And this is the situation in 2021, which was the end of my study. And now there's 65 zones in the 24 states that I've included in my study. And I'll zoom in on like Kansas and Nebraska, and you can see that sometimes these zones can get very complicated pretty quickly. It's hard to figure out like where you are, and I'm happy I'm not a hunter in Nebraska. So many more zones. Also, what has changed is the number of days a zone is open. You can see it's been up and down. In the 90s, it was lowered a little bit because of like low duck numbers nationwide. After that, it has opened a lot. And you think like, oh, that's above 70. But that is because it also includes states in the central flyways. And there's a couple of states that can have their hunting season be open for a longer time period. So you might think like, okay, there's more open days, but how does that affect where these ducks are hunted? Well, they have changed quite a lot, and I have a couple of GIFs here that you can kind of see how many open days a particular state has in the month of, in this case, we'll start with December. So it's a little GIF on the right. You can see it's looping through the years, and the bluer it is, the longer a state was open in the month of December, all the way to like 31 days. And it's almost there. It goes to 2021. And if you compare this picture with the one on the bottom left, which is the 1960 situation, you can see that more northern states and zones are open for at least part of December. So we're shooting ducks further north during that month, or at least we have the possibility to do so. And when we look at January, the difference is even more striking. Again, on the bottom left, you see the 1960 situation, and almost no states had an open hunting season in January in 1960. We'll fast forward to today, or 2021, and we can see that there's actually most of the South has been open the whole month of January. And quite a lot of states have at least part of the state open in January in the North as well, especially in the central flyway. So yes, the hunting sampling scheme has changed a little bit, and we want to correct for that. So we can see nowadays we collect bands about 3 degrees latitude higher or further north in December and 2 degrees further north. So there's a substantial effect. So yes, yeah, we corrected for this hunting latitude in our analysis, just make sure that like we see not a response in like hunting of these ducks with the ducks not moving, but actually can draw some conclusions on where the ducks are and if that has changed. And if you want to read more about that, that's in our first paper. All right, so a little bit back to that banding and wing harvest data. So yes, we think to a large extent, and there's nuance, we can use this as a proxy for duck distributions. So why this is such a great data set is because it's a long time since they've been banding birds and collecting wings, and that resulted in humongous sample sizes. So for this study, we included 15 species. And you can see 8 species of dabbling ducks in the top half of your screen and 7 species of diving ducks in the bottom half of your screen. And then the numbers below and above their species code represent the number of bands that we have included in the study and the number of wings that we have included in the study. And you see that sample sizes can go for like mallards. We have almost 400,000 band recoveries for mallards. So we have a humongous amount of data. That's very exciting. So how does that kind of look on a map? Well, we have lots of data, and we have to find the patterns, right? Like has this distribution. So what you see on this map here, this is all these band recoveries from mallards in 1970. They're throughout the entire country. So there's a lot of data, and somehow we want to quantify whether this cloud of points has moved further north or have shifted in some other way. So the next one is a little GIF, just to give you an idea about what the data looks like for each year. And it's kind of cool to see like that you can clearly see where the big rivers are on this map, and that a lot of mallards have been shot in those locations. It makes sense. Ducks like water, but I thought it was kind of cool to see how well it pops up. When you put it on a scatter plot, things look a little messy. As I said, there's a lot of data, but you can make some sense out of it. So our first step was to just look, have bands been recovered further north than before, and just draw a regression line through it. So in this case, we see that, yeah, mallard bands in January have been obtained about 3 degrees latitude, or 330 kilometers, or about 200 miles further north than they used to on average. And so we did this for all 15 species. And I'll show you some December and January work. We also did some September, October, and November work. But for this talk, I just want to focus on the winter. And what we can see is that all the dabbling ducks, which are listed in green, you can see the species names on the left, have moved their band recovery locations in the squares and their wing recovery locations in the circles. And if it's a black icon, that means it's significantly positive, so further north. If it's a gray icon, we didn't see anything. And anything that is red means that it actually shifted significantly further south over time. There's a couple locations, especially with diving ducks, where you see canvasback, red hat, and ringneck duck that moved a little bit further south according to some data sets. In January, it's equally striking overall. Again, we see that most species shift northwards, and quite a lot so. We see the dabbling ducks, according to bands, about 200 miles, according to wings, about 150 miles, diving ducks, about 87 miles, and wings, about 37 miles. So less so, but systematic across species. It seems to be that most species are moving further north over time in this 1960 to 2021 period. All right, so that's the first part. Just to reiterate, we see northward shifts for most species during December and January, and especially for dabbling ducks. All right. As I said at the start of my talk, we catch a lot of birds and we band a lot of birds, but we do this throughout the entire continent. In Canada, most of the northern US. So you wonder, do all individuals do the same thing? Pulled up this like a flyway picture again, where you can see that there's lots of birds that are breeding in completely different areas and then sort themselves according to their migratory flyway when they move south. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. In this case, we mostly see an east-west gradient in data. And these banding efforts have not been constant over time. So you can imagine that if there's a big effect of where birds are banded in where they are recovered in the winter, and these banding efforts have changed over time, that might be a problem because you might draw wrong conclusions. To kind of help that, we divided our data in 3 big areas according to these joint venture habitat delineations. In this case, we decided for both a north-south split and an east-west split, and came up with the following. So in yellow, you see the upper Mississippi River Great Lakes region and Ontario. And then in blue, we have the Western Boreal area and the prairie habitat, which is part of the prairie pothole region, but just the Canadian part. And then in red, we have the prairie pothole and northern Great Plains of the US. So as I said, a little bit north-south and a little bit east-west separation there to make sure that we don't mix up those signals of where birds have been breeding when we interpret our results on where birds have been recovered. So for this step, we wanted to go into a little bit more detail. And we used a technique called kernel density estimators. And what it does, it kind of draws a little polygon of different sizes around your data points and kind of sums up. So in this case, what we have here is the 50% isoplat. And what that means is like 50%, the core 50% of your data points fit in that polygon. And all the other 50% of the points that are more spread out, they fall outside that. So it really gives you a good idea about like where is the core group of birds hanging out in the winter. And so what you see here, this is just an example, but in the following maps, I'll show you similar things. In red, the red polygon and the red dots represent the current situation, and the black dots and the gray polygon represent 1960 to 1969. So like the first decade of data we had. And we did this because this could be a pretty visual tool for managers. So they can actually see, okay, so where are the areas that they no longer inhabit in the winter, and where are the areas that they now are hanging out in the winter that they didn't used to before. So to do this, we need relatively large sample sizes for statistical tests. So we only did this for like 3 species. But all these 3 species tell a very, very different story. And I'll dive into that in a second. But first, a sip of water. All right, we'll start with the mallard story. So I'll show a couple figures like this in the bottom. So what we see here on the y-axis, you see the centroid latitude. So this middle location, the central location of this cloud. And on the x-axis, you can see the years over time. For now, we're going to ignore the red and the blue lines. Those are for September and October and November. And we'll only focus on the yellow December and the black January lines. And what you see for mallards is that in all these 3 banding locations, so the prairie habitat, western boreal area, prairie pothole, northern Great Plains, and on the right, the upper Mississippi River and Ontario, they all have moved further north, independently of breeding region. So about 330 to 550 kilometers, or 2 to about 350 miles. And in January, less so. The black line doesn't move up that much, but still pretty substantially. And it's a pretty gradual increase. What we also see is when we look at the northern extent, so the northern boundary of that core area, it has shifted, especially in December, the yellow line. It moved up quite a lot, actually. And especially when we look at the rightmost picture of the upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes in Ontario. And when you put this on a map, you can see that now this core area has moved so far north, it actually includes parts of Ohio, which is crazy. So mallards been moving up. How about pintails? They tell a slightly different story. Again, what we see here, December and January, the blue lines have been moving up quite a lot, about roughly comparable numbers as mallards. We see very large changes in the northern extent or northern range of this core area, especially during December. These both these yellow and black lines, they're really shooting up and show a much larger shift than in the centroid. So about 555 kilometers, or about 350 miles. And the result of that is that they're actually occupying a much larger area than they used to. So this is the relative area. So it starts at 100%, and then it moves up, well, as you can see, quite a lot, especially in December. It's often this core area where it's like 50% of most clustered points are located. It's almost twice as large in December, more than twice as large even, and more than 1.5 times larger in January than it used to. So that's pretty crazy. And when we look at a map, we see the following. Yes, like the southern part of where the core area is actually hasn't changed much. It's mostly that it has extended, it become much bigger, and has shifted much further north. So you got the same amount of birds spread out of a much bigger area. And for the final species, blue-winged teal, which is just an interesting case, we actually see no shifts at all, like nothing. You see some in the red line, but the blue, yellow, and the black lines, they're pretty much completely flat. We don't see a shift at all. Although, as we said, well, we expected big shifts because so many things have been changing. And when we look at the map, especially on the left, the red, the current decades of data, perfectly overlaps the 1960 to 1969 polygon. You can't even see the black dot. It's just completely covered. And the prairie pothole northern Great Plains might have shifted a little bit to the west, but still lots of overlap, and definitely not a shift towards the north. So pretty cool. One thing though I want to highlight is that if you remember, these birds also occur in like South and in Latin America, South and like Central America. And we don't know what's happening there, right? This is not the southern extent of their entire range. It could be that the rest of the range is actually moving up a little bit. They're staying further north in South America. But the band recovery data there is not as sufficient, not as thorough. Thorough is not the right words. There's just not that many bands recovered there and reported. So it's hard to draw conclusions. All right, to kind of sum this part up, so a little bit more detail for these three species. So that mallards and northern pintails mostly do the same. They're both moving up in December and January. However, there's some variation in response among subpopulations, so which is pretty interesting. And it makes you wonder if like events at the breeding grounds could partially drive these winter distributions. We get a lot more birds from certain breeding grounds, and they naturally stay further north. Then overall, it might look like that all ducks stay further north, although it might be just a shift in like how many ducks come from where. What we see is also that the shifts in centroids and the northern extent are much greater than the southern extent. And what this means is that we mostly see an expansion of the range further north, with a sort of southern boundary of the range that kind of trailing behind a little bit. When we look at northern pintail by itself, we saw that there's use a much larger area during December and January versus the 1960s, almost twice or more than twice as much. And that's interesting because the breeding pintail population numbers right now on continental scale are like much lower compared to that time period. So it's actually a lot fewer animals spread out over a larger area. It might seem that there's just birds are moving north while they're just being diluted to an extent. And then finally, I was very surprised to see these results. No change at all in the band recovery distributions in December and January. And that could be predominantly caused by the blue-winged teal are one of these species that is very reliant on photo period, so the length of the day. And so it could be that since that hasn't changed much, neither has the migration behavior and wintering behavior of these birds. However, these differences in responses among species, they might have consequences for managers because they might require species-specific management. All right. For my last part of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about what actually drives these changes. So I'm bringing this slide back to kind of remind you that, yes, we have seen widespread changes in climate and weather conditions, in the amount of wetlands and agricultural and urban land cover on the landscape, and that it has been changing quite substantially, right? Well, for this particular exercise, we wanted to make sure we could link all these band recovery data to these covariates, I guess, these land cover classes and this temperature and precipitation data in a sensible way. So what we did, we created a hexagon grid. So we just divided the entire Central and Mississippi flyway up in a bunch of equally sized hexagons. They're about 10,000 square kilometers, and I'm not entirely sure how many square miles that is. My apologies. And for all those hexagon tiles, we could come up with these covariate values. First of all, I want to state again that we, again, for this data analysis, we split up the data according to these three banding regions of interest, just to correct for like any effect that like where the bird is coming from results in and where the bird has been found. So what we did first, as you can see on the left, we plotted all the band recoveries, and we just simply looked, okay, the relative number of bands that have been recovered in a certain hexagon tile in a certain area of North America. How has that changed over time? Do we see like more or fewer band recoveries in this area? So that's kind of what this slide shows. All the grayed out hexagon tiles, or the ones you don't see, they don't show any significant change. This is for one breeding area, the prairie habitat and the western boreal area birds. And in areas in red show increases over time, areas in blue show decreases over time. And the bluer or redder it is, the stronger the increase or decrease. So there's a couple areas to highlight. For example, here we see a lot more birds in Oklahoma and Kansas. And this kind of corresponds with a finding that we see that some of these birds populations shift further west. It could just be because there's more birds in Oklahoma and Kansas. We also see that there's some increases up the Mississippi River, and declines occur in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley in Louisiana, Mississippi. So natural conclusion would be like this is a pattern that probably leads to a northward shift. So that corresponds pretty well. And as we saw earlier work, we saw shifts about like 50 to like 350 miles or 134 to 603 kilometers between in this time frame. When we look at the prairie pothole northern Great Plains, we can see again kind of a similar pattern. Decreases in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, increases up the Mississippi River. We don't see as much of a signal in Kansas and Oklahoma, but we do see decreases further west in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. So a slightly different pattern. They seem to be maybe shifting more to the northeast more than anything. And then finally, birds that were banded in the upper Mississippi, Great Lakes, and Ontario region, first of all, are not very often recovered in the central flyway. So in western states like Montana and Colorado, New Mexico, etc. They're very much clustered on the east, as you can see. And in this case, we see that's a very clear increase in bands in the northern mid-latitude states and a similar decrease among the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. And just to kind of highlight how well this like links up with our earlier findings, this is the same picture just based on these kernel density estimators, these polygons, and we'll highlight the same areas. And you can see that, yes, the areas where we saw earlier expansion indeed also show the biggest increases in band density. So that's great. We saw that this technique works. It shows the right things. All right. So we saw these increases and decreases. And then the last thing we wanted to do was like link these to covariates of interest. So things that we were interested in that maybe could potentially explain like why these things are happening. So in this case, we used the linear regression model, and then we used a bunch of covariates. So we used for the climate, we used precipitation, minimum temperature, the number of frost days, and snow depth. And we could extract that for every single hexagon tile. So we'd have a value for all these things, and we could relate that to like how many ducks that were seen. So we see here, we see the minimum temperature, the average minimum temperature over the last like 36 years. We also see the change in temperature. And the redder it is, the larger the change has been, the larger the increase has been. You see no blue tiles, there's no decreases in temperatures in this same time. So we see that in the north, there's like larger or greater increases than in the south. We also used a couple land cover or land use variables. In this case, you can see here, we used agriculture, which is depicted on the map, and an urban area, and also wetlands or just water to begin with. So in this case, you can see clear agricultural cover where you might expect it, you know, along the rivers and in Western states. It's kind of cool to like actually depict some of these patterns. So for all these covariates, we used the long-term average from 1984 to 2019, because some of these data sets were not available before 1984, which is a bummer because we did have data, band recovery data since the 1960s, but so is reality. And we also looked at the 34-year change over that same time period. So like how much did agriculture increase by or decrease by in a certain area? All right. So given these variables, what did we find? So what really determines where waterfowl are? What we found was land use effects were much bigger than climate effects, which was a little surprising. So this is just where do we find them on an average year? And this could be because, well, we already limited our study to the occupied range of ducks. We weren't really looking, but explained where the ducks like were outside of this range and where they are now. And so it could be that the range of a duck species or many species is already limited by climatic constraints. It could be one of the reasons. To kind of dive in, like what we specifically found, we found that cropland was actually the most important explainer of where ducks are in general. And this was especially the case when temperatures were low. So when you can see on the right there in this graph, there's 3 lines overall cropland on the x-axis. The more cropland you have in your hexagon pile, the higher your relative abundance of mallard band recoveries are. And this blue line shows that when temperature is high, this line is a lot steeper, this relationship. So if minimum temperatures are low, this line is a lot flatter. So this could maybe point that maybe these croplands are only used when they're actually available. So in places where, or years, when temperatures are below or above freezing and they're not covered in snow, only then might these ducks actually key on in some of these resources. And that makes sense. But we also found that urban areas are very important when or where it is cold. And when I say urban areas, I mean Chicago. Although there's a lake there, so maybe that was a bad example, but you have to forgive me. I'm more talking about suburban areas or areas with like sparse housing, and at least places that have some open water and are not constantly disturbed. You see that the urban cover goes to 40 or 50% or something like that. And it's interesting. Normally, the blue line, which means that like high temperatures, the yellow line, which are medium temperatures, normally it seems like birds try to avoid urban cover. But when the temperatures are cold or in areas where it's cold, it seems that this relationship is more positive. So it could be maybe potentially that urban areas function as a heat island. It's known that like temperatures in urban areas are a little bit higher than areas that are more rural. And potentially those might be the only places where water is still open. Also, it could be that they make use of those kind of opportunities to stay further north during the winter so that they don't have to travel as much in the spring, which is very time sensitive time for them. So how about changes in band recovery abundance and duck abundance over time? So we now just looked at like what explains where the ducks are in general, but what really explained the changes that we witnessed? Well, those were completely different. We mostly saw effects of climate and not of land use and changes in there. So that was kind of cool, very different. We saw pretty strong effects of minimum temperature. So we saw was the duck abundance increases most steeply in the areas with the greatest temperature increases. And that was especially in the north. So this might be causing more areas to be open for ducks longer, like cause ice to not form as much, or overall ice layers not be as thick or like as long on lakes and other places, and overall food resources might be available longer as well. What we also found was that water cover is pretty important. You might think, okay, well, ducks are, they swim, they like water, and that's true. But we actually saw mostly a positive trend of ducks where water on the landscape has actually increased. And it could be potentially due to restoration efforts. The places where we saw lots of increases in water cover over time, that's where we also saw like the largest increases in duck abundance or band recovery abundance over time. All right, I talked for a long time, and I'll take you home with some take-home messages. I'll start with the take-home messages for the ducks. So I don't know if there's any ducks in the audience, but this might be of interest to you too. First of all, we showed that duck harvest distributions have moved north during the last 60 years, sometimes quite substantially so. And this is most likely because the ducks are now wintering farther north, because you try to account as much as possible for differences in hunting pressure and changes over time. And these findings actually match earlier work that used other data sources such as eBird and Christmas bird count, band recoveries, or simulated data. There's a bunch of papers listed there, and all of them kind of concluded the same thing. Over time, ducks have stay further north during the winter. And we also have some take-home messages for managers. We saw some pretty cool differences among species and different species groups. We saw that dabblers show greater responses than divers, and that could be potentially driven by differences in diet. Diving ducks are not as dependent on agricultural resources. They mostly just dive in the water. They also do need water to be available for them to actually inhabit. And this might lead to group-specific management plans. We also saw that winter locations of mallards differed between breeding populations. And although all are shifting, there were substantial differences. And so that means that events at the breeding grounds could partially drive the winter distributions as well. Talked about that a little. And if, the third would be differences among species and breeding populations makes management more complex. And no one size fits all in this case. Mallards are a good example. They seem to be doing certain things that represent an average of what all other species are doing, but they don't really match any other species in their behavior. Every species is a little bit different, and that makes management challenging. We also saw that both land use and climate variables were important, and they actually interact together. We saw that croplands might be important to determine where birds are, but only when they're available and minimum temperatures are a little bit hotter than normal. We also saw that potentially like water cover increases had a positive effect. So potentially wetland restoration might have to happen in areas that might become more important for wintering ducks in the future and not necessarily in the places where they used to. And then there's also some take-home messages for hunters or bird watchers. And this is especially relevant in the South. And when I give this talk there, people are very disappointed, but they might just see fewer hunting or recreation opportunities in the southern states for some of these species because they no longer occur in those kind of densities that they used to, just because they're staying further north. For people here in Minnesota, it might be good news because there might be more birds staying further north. And you might see that as well, despite the annual variation in ducks from year to year. And also might need different timing of hunting or recreation opportunities in other states. They might be migrating at different times. They might be staying longer, or it's a cool opportunity. All right, with that, I would like to acknowledge a bunch of funding agencies and collaborators that I worked with. This project was a Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center project. We worked with the USGS, we worked with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, University of Missouri, the co-op unit there. We worked also with Ducks Unlimited, and the Central and Mississippi Flyway Councils assisted as well. And of course, I want to thank you for your attention and thanks for tuning in. That was awesome. If you have any questions, and please contact me by email. They're just listed there, and I think we're going to answer some questions first live as well. So thank you.
Great job. That was super interesting. It's great to see all these organizations coming together and helping out with these studies and learning more about our ducks. So I get it. One question, I'm not overly familiar with iBird, but somebody asked, they have 8 years worth of wildlife sightings in WSP, I'm guessing that's West St. Paul, Yard and Woods. Would eBird be interested in? How would you get it to them? I'm not for sure.
Yeah. So eBird is awesome. It's a science, as I said, a citizen science project. They got a great app and a website as well, and you can enter any bird list you do. So it even if you just go outside for a couple minutes and count what birds you see, you can just enter your bird list, and this could be now like a bird list you're about to do now. You can also enter historical data, and many people have done that. People used to write down all the birds that they've seen in notebooks, and they might have data from like the 70s or 80s, and you can still enter that. And millions of people have done that. So it's a worldwide resource that's used here in North America mostly. It's also being used in Europe and in other places in the world. It's a great data source, and people are using it more and more for scientific projects as well. And you can be part of that.
It's pretty cool because, you know, the more we know, right, the better results we'll have and the more information we have. So it's kind of cool.
Absolutely. Plus, it's a great way to like keep track of how many birds you've seen in the world. And I might be close to 500. So I'm like definitely counting, hoping to break that barrier soon.
It's impressive. That's a lot of birds.
I cheat. I travel to Europe a lot. So
I have one question. They're trying to clear up the I'll just read the question here. I'm puzzled by the positive correlation between cropland and ducks. Is this because of an increase in water on croplands?
Yeah, that is a great question, and we go into detail a little bit more in our manuscript. I didn't have time for that. Unfortunately, a lot of these croplands occur where wetlands used to be, and also we have some restrictions in the data. The data that we use, a lot of these cropland layers, these spatial layers we use to answer these questions, they often have a resolution of about 30 by 30 meters. So it could be that there's a smaller wetlands hiding in that. And that's really hard to disentangle. So there's a lot of overlap in areas that are now used for cropland that might or might not still have some water on them. But aside from that nuance, we did see such a strong response to cropland that we do also consider the availability of food resources that are now available in these cropland areas to be a positive thing for the ducks themselves. But that's a great point. They do go hand in hand to a large extent.
Great. Again, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Slido there. So you got one more that just came in. Get back to it. Does the increase in temperature compress the migration period? In other words, if ice comes late, do more birds migrate in a shorter period of time?
Yeah, let me try to distill that. So first of all, yeah, so migration in the spring is often super time constrained. Birds want to get up to the breeding ground as quickly as possible, preferably be the first ones there, and get going and try to get a brood off. The fall migration is often a little bit more relaxed. You see lots of species that birds hang out as far north as they can for the longest time possible. So they're in Minnesota, they might just keep hanging out until weather gets so bad that they really have to move further down. Could you repeat the question?
Well, now you're going to make me look it up again.
My apologies.
Does the increase in temperature compress the migration period? So if ice
Okay, yes.
comes later, they migrate in a shorter period of time.
Yeah, yeah. So again, yeah, I kind of relate to what I said. It does cause birds to move north earlier in the spring, and we do also see a condensation of like the amount of time that they use. In the fall, it's an interesting story. We actually saw that because birds move further north earlier, that there's also some birds that move further south earlier, but it was a very complex pattern. So we don't see, I guess my answer would be we don't see a clear signal,
Oh,
which is,
interesting.
super unsatisfying, but a research opportunity.
I notice, where I live, the East Metro area, it's, some years we get pelicans, and it's my assumption is that the lakes that they're going to are still iced over or have enough ice on them that they're stopping in the metro area where we have open water here. So it's kind of an interesting topic and why they decide to do what they do, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I briefly talked about a Christmas bird count, which is like a great also citizen science project. You can get involved. People just count all the birds in a certain circle around the town. And during those, it's the middle of winter. That's often around Christmas. That's why it's named. You still see, the occasional mallard, occasional Canada goose that they're just hanging out in an area that is maybe artificially kept open, large enough water body. Or if it's a warm year, she said, it could be that there's just more places for them to stay longer. Um, definitely an effect of us to an extent.
Yeah. Well, Bram, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and passion on ducks across the landscape here in the United States. Really appreciate that today. And for everybody out there, all these webinars are recorded and put on our website at mndnr.gov/discover. You can find them all there in our archives. Our next one, if you didn't hear me in the beginning, is going to be our 244th episode. That's actually going to happen on September 9th. This is our 75th anniversary of the WMA, the Wildlife Management Areas across the state. So we're going to do a kind of a 4-part series, but covering the 3 biomes in Minnesota. So we're going to start out with wetlands on September 9th. So Everybody, I hope you get outside, enjoys the end of summer and some of this beautiful fall weather that'll be joining us in beginning of September. Get outside, be safe, take somebody new outdoors with you, and we'll see you here in a few weeks. So take care.